On a quiet Sunday morning in March 1945, inside a convent kitchen in occupied Poland, a 52-year-old nun named Sister Maria Antonina stirred a massive iron pot of golden vegetable soup. Steam curled upward, the smell of carrots and potatoes filling the room. Her hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had cooked all her life. But beneath her gray habit, tied to her waist, was a small pouch containing a vial of rat poison. In less than 2 hours, she would attempt one of the boldest acts of resistance in the entire war, and then she would disappear, her name erased from almost every record. This is the story they never taught you. You need to understand something. She wasn't a trained spy. She wasn't a soldier. She was a woman who had spent 30 years in prayer and silence. She had taken vows of poverty and obedience. She had never fired a gun or raised her voice, but on that Sunday morning, she made a decision that would save hundreds of lives and destroy her own. The question isn't if she did it. The question is how a woman of God convinced herself that killing was an act of mercy. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why she felt she had no choice. Let's go back 6 years. 1939, Poland, caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, was about to become the bloodiest battlefield of the war. The convent where Sister Maria lived had stood for over 200 years, a place of refuge, healing, and devotion. The nuns ran a small hospital, a school for orphaned girls, and a soup kitchen for the poor. Sister Maria cooked meals for the sick and the hungry. People said her soup could cure sadness, but when the Wehrmacht rolled into Posen in September 1939, everything changed. The Nazis didn't just occupy Poland, they tried to erase it. Priests were arrested, schools closed, books burned, and even the language banned. Convents were seized or destroyed. The convent of the Sacred Heart was turned into something unrecognizable. Himmler's SS transformed it into a rest facility for officers coming off the Eastern Front, men who had overseen massacres and deportations, now sleeping in the same beds where nuns once prayed. Sister Maria and 4 other nuns were allowed to stay, but only to cook and clean for the officers. They washed blood-stained uniforms. They served meals while pretending not to hear the officers laugh about burned villages and executed families. For 5 years, Sister Maria lived in this nightmare. She watched the convent she loved become a shrine to evil. She prayed every night for deliverance, but deliverance never came, so she decided to create it herself. By early 1945, the war was collapsing. The Red Army was closing in. Germany was falling apart, but the SS officers at the convent still held grand Sunday lunches, celebrating victories that no longer existed. Sister Maria knew these men would escape justice. They would vanish into the ruins of Germany, so she made a choice. On the second Sunday of March, she would serve her famous soup with one final ingredient. The decision didn't come in a single moment. It grew slowly, frost on a window. For years, she lived in a moral gray zone that would break most people. Every morning, she woke to officers drilling in the courtyard. Every afternoon, she served men who discussed genocide like weather. Every evening, she knelt in a chapel stripped of its holy icons, praying for guidance and hearing only silence. The breaking point came in January 1945, during one of the coldest winters in Poland's history. A line of skeletal Jewish prisoners was being marched past the convent. One young woman, no older than 20, collapsed in the snow. From the kitchen window, Sister Maria watched an SS officer walk over, pull out his pistol, and shoot her in the head. No hesitation, no emotion. Then he walked inside and asked Sister Maria for more bread. That night, something inside her shattered. She realized her silence wasn't faith, it was cowardice. The convent was no longer a holy place. Its walls were defiled, its purpose gone. All that remained was an illusion of holiness serving 50 murderers who would kill again. She thought of the girl in the snow. She thought of the thousands already dead while she stirred soup and baked bread. And she made a vow. If God would not act, she would. But she knew she couldn't be reckless. The SS were paranoid. disciplined, and always alert. The convent was under constant surveillance. Every delivery was inspected, every visitor questioned. The officers rotated their schedules without pattern, making it impossible for anyone to anticipate who would be where at any given time. But Sister Maria had something none of them noticed anymore. She had become part of the background. 5 years of silent obedience had turned her into something the Germans no longer registered. She wasn't a servant to them. She was a fixture in the room, a harmless old nun who cooked, cleaned, kept her eyes down, and made no trouble. They trusted her with the same careless confidence men give to things they believe cannot harm them. They never imagined she was watching. Over the next weeks, Sister Maria began to prepare. She memorized patterns the officers didn't even realize they followed, noting which days they congregated in the largest numbers. Sunday noon stood out immediately. Every Sunday, all 50 officers filled the main dining hall for their traditional lunch. Attendance wasn't optional. It was a ritual designed to maintain unity, and none of them dared skip it. The meal always opened the same way, with steaming bowls of soup served in large porcelain tureens. And that soup was always made by Sister Maria, alone, unsupervised, trusted completely. What they didn't know was that the convent cellar held something far deadlier than onions and broth. Arsenic trioxide, rat poison, kept there for the rodents that infested the old stone walls. In tiny amounts, it caused illness. In large amounts, it killed. Quickly, quietly. Sister Maria realized that if she could dissolve enough of it into the soup without altering its taste, and if every officer took even one full bowl, the outcome would be devastating. But the danger was enormous. One suspicious glance, one officer refusing to eat, and she would be dragged into the courtyard and executed before anyone could intervene. The morning she had chosen arrived warmer than expected. Snow melted into thick mud that pooled in the courtyard. Sister Maria rose before the others, her hands trembling as she dressed. Her heart thudded so hard it felt as if the silence itself could hear it. She had barely slept. All night she questioned everything, every step, every detail, every risk. But the same images returned again and again. A young woman collapsing in the snow, the bodies in mass graves, the children torn from their mothers. There was no turning back. Before dawn, she entered the quiet kitchen. Only a thin stripe of gray light filtered through the high window. She lit the old oil lamps and their glow crawled across the stone floors and wooden counters. She moved calmly, retrieving vegetables from the pantry, assembling ingredients she had used countless times: carrots, onions, potatoes, herbs, stock, ordinary things, familiar things. She filled the heavy iron pot and set it over the flame, chopping vegetables with sharp, steady rhythm. She had made this soup more times than she could remember, and today she was making it for the last time. By mid-morning, the soup was ready, golden, fragrant, perfectly seasoned. She tasted a small spoonful to ensure everything was exactly as it should be, and then she reached into her habit and removed the tiny glass vial she had hidden. Inside was the fine white powder she had measured the night before. Her hand trembled as she opened it. This was the moment she could not undo. She hesitated, thinking briefly of the commandment she was about to break, but another commandment echoed louder, the one that forbade standing idle while innocent blood was shed. She emptied the powder into the pot. It vanished instantly, leaving no trace. She stirred slowly, deliberately, then stepped back and whispered a prayer, not asking for forgiveness, but for strength to finish what she had begun. By the time the officers filled the dining hall, their voices loud and carefree, the final act of her plan was already in motion. Rumors of the war ending had lifted their spirits. They joked, they laughed, oblivious to the fact that they had less than half an hour to live. Sister Maria entered the hall with the porcelain tureens balanced on a wooden cart, her expression calm, her steps steady. She served them their last meal without a single word. They barely acknowledged her. To them, she was nothing more than the old nun who drifted silently through the halls, the woman who served without speaking. One officer waved her away impatiently. Another joked crudely about the soup being the only decent thing in this miserable convent. Sister Maria said nothing. She bowed her head, turned back toward the kitchen, and waited. She stood in the doorway, hidden by the shadows, watching through a thin crack as the officers began their meal. The dining hall buzzed with noise. Laughter bounced off the stone walls. Silverware rattled. Wine glasses clinked in loud toasts to victory, to the fatherland, to themselves. Their black uniforms gleamed in the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. They looked untouchable, but Sister Maria knew the truth. She knew that within an hour, most of them would be on the floor, clutching their stomachs, begging for help they would never receive. She felt no sense of triumph, only a cold, steady certainty that this was necessary. The soup bowls emptied quickly. Officers praised the flavor, calling it her best yet. A young lieutenant, barely older than a boy, asked for another serving, then another. She felt something twist inside her, guilt maybe, or the painful. But he had chosen his uniform. He had chosen what he stood for, and so had she. They continued eating, unaware of what was already moving through their blood. Arsenic was patient. It worked slowly, quietly. The first cramps could take half an hour or more, and she had timed everything with precision. At 12:45, the first sign appeared. The young lieutenant stumbled to his feet, pale and shaken, mumbling that he needed air. No one paid attention, but 10 minutes later, another officer stood, then another. Soon 3 more. The room that had been roaring with laughter began to fall silent. Confusion spread, then concern, then fear. An officer vomited on the floor. Another collapsed, gripping his chest. Panic erupted. Voices rose, chairs crashed. Someone screamed for a medic. Someone else shouted that they'd been poisoned. Sister Maria stepped back into the kitchen, pressing herself against the cold stone. She heard everything, the screams, the choking, the thud of bodies falling. She closed her eyes and prayed, not for the dying men, but for her own soul. She prayed that God would understand that this sin was meant to prevent greater sins, that these 50 men, if left alive, would one day walk free, their crimes buried under new identities. By 1:15, chaos ruled the hall. Officers convulsed on the floor, vomiting blood, gasping for breath. Medics rushed in, but arsenic offered no mercy. Many died within hours. Others suffered for days. In the end, 47 of the 50 were gone. 3 survived only because they'd eaten too little, too late. And Sister Maria, the quiet nun who had served them for 5 long years, disappeared without a trace. The moment she heard the first screams, she knew her old life was finished. There would be no forgiveness, no leniency. The SS punished resistance with public execution, and not just for the guilty. The other nuns, the townspeople, anyone connected to her would pay the price. She had known this all along, which was why she had prepared everything as carefully as she had prepared the soup. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her small room was a bundle, civilian clothing, a forged identity card, a handful of Polish notes, and a hand-drawn map leading west to the Allied lines. She had spent months assembling it with help from a resistance contact who visited under the guise of delivering supplies. They didn't know her full plan, but they knew enough to prepare a way out. All she had to do was reach the rendezvous point, an abandoned farmhouse 3 kilometers north, by nightfall. But now the convent was crawling with SS guards. Every exit was watched. The compound was in complete lockdown. No one was entering. No one was leaving. Sister Maria moved quickly but with purpose. She slipped out of her nun's habit and into the plain gray dress and headscarf she had hidden for months. The forged identity identity card went into her pocket. Maria Kowalski, a widowed seamstress. It wasn't perfect, but it might buy her seconds. Seconds she desperately needed. She stayed away from the main corridors and turned instead into the hidden passageways only the sisters knew. Centuries-old tunnels that once protected nuns during invasions. They connected the chapel to the kitchen to the sleeping quarters, and the sleeping quarters to the cellar. And from the cellar, a forgotten drainage tunnel led beyond the convent walls. Narrow, rotting, dangerous, but it was her only escape. As she descended the stone steps, she could already hear the boots above. Sharp, violent, searching. The Germans were sweeping the building. They would question the nuns. They would pressure them. They would demand answers. The sisters knew nothing, but the SS never cared about innocence. The guilt stabbed her hard, but she forced it down. Feelings would slow her. Feelings would kill her. She reached the cellar's far corner where old crates hid the entrance to the drainage tunnel. She dragged them aside, exposing the narrow gap. Air thick with rot rushed out. She didn't stop. She dropped to her knees and crawled in. The tunnel felt endless. Moist walls brushed her shoulders. Jagged stones tore her dress. Every breath was shallow. If the tunnel collapsed, she would be buried alive. But she kept moving. One thought drove her forward. Survive. Survive to tell the truth. Survive so those 47 deaths wouldn't disappear in silence. A faint circle of daylight appeared. She crawled faster, ignoring the blood, ignoring the pain. Then, finally, she broke into the open air. She lay in a ditch behind overgrown bushes, her body shaking, but she forced herself back up. She brushed off the dirt and began walking north, toward the farmhouse, toward freedom, toward whatever future waited for her. The journey should have taken under an hour, but nothing was normal. She was 52, with no training, no weapons, and no experience in hostile territory. German patrols roamed everywhere. She avoided roads and moved through fields and forests instead, zigzagging through the landscape. Every sound made her freeze. A twig snapping, a dog barking, a distant engine. Each noise sent fear crashing through her, but she pushed on. Twice she had to hide. The first time, a patrol vehicle rolled down a dirt road only meters away. She pressed herself into the mud as two SS officers stepped out, smoking and talking about the poisoning. They joked about it. They laughed. They had no idea the woman they were hunting was right behind the fallen tree. When they left, she waited 10 long minutes before moving again. The second time was worse. She heard voices and dropped into thorny bushes as an entire SS unit marched past. At least 20 soldiers armed and moving with cold purpose. They were heading toward the convent, a special response unit, the kind the Nazis sent when they wanted to make an example, when they wanted to instill fear. Sister Maria felt the weight of her actions settle heavily on her chest. The nuns still inside, the surrounding towns, the consequences marching straight toward them. She had chosen her path. Now she had to survive it. She had always known there would be consequences. She had accepted that long before the moment arrived. But knowing something and standing in the middle of its reality were two very different things. By the time Sister Maria reached the abandoned farmhouse, the last light of day was fading. The sky had turned into a bruised blend of purple streaked with orange and red. The farmhouse looked exactly as the resistance contact had described, a collapsing two-story shell with a sunken roof and walls blackened by old fire. Burned during the first German invasion in 1939, it had been left to rot. No one came here anymore. No one, except the people who needed a place to vanish. Sister Maria moved cautiously, studying the silent fields around her for any sign of a trap. When she was certain she was alone, she slipped through a gap in the wall. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of charred wood and rot. The room was dark, littered with broken furniture. Glass crunched softly under her feet. In the far corner, half hidden beneath a fallen beam, she saw a wooden crate. Her heart lifted. The resistance had been here. She dragged the crate out and forced it open. Inside were supplies, bread, dried meat, a small canteen of water, a wool blanket, and a note written in Polish. It said only, "Stay until dark. Someone will come for you. Do not light a fire. Do not make noise. Trust no one." Sister Maria lowered herself to the floor, her body finally giving in. She ate a small piece of bread, took a careful sip of water, wrapped herself in the blanket, and for the first time since morning, let herself cry. Not from fear, not from guilt, but from the raw relief of survival. She had done it. She had poisoned 50 SS officers and escaped. The first part of her mission was complete, but she knew the hardest part was still in front of her. She had to live long enough to tell the world what she had done, and she had to carry the weight of a line she could never step back from. She awoke to the sound of footsteps crunching through broken glass. Her eyes shot open, her senses snapping into focus. The farmhouse was pitch black. She couldn't see a thing, but she could hear every sound. Slow, controlled footsteps, more than one person. They were already inside. Her hand scrambled across the floor until it found a piece of splintered wood. Useless, but it was all she had. Pressing her back against the wall, she held her breath and waited. Then a woman's voice broke the darkness. She spoke Polish, the rural accent unmistakable, and she spoke a name. Not Sister Maria, but the name Maria Antonina Wysoka, the name she had been born with 52 years ago, long before she had taken vows. The voice said, "We are friends. We've come to take you home." They weren't what she expected. 3 resistance fighters entered, 2 men and 1 woman. None of them looked like soldiers. The woman, dressed in peasant clothes, looked worn by years of hardship. 1 man was older, limping, a scar dragging across his cheek. The third was barely a boy, maybe 18, his nervous eyes flicking constantly toward the door. They searched the farmhouse quickly, making sure no one had followed. The older man introduced himself as Pota. He told her they were part of a resistance network that had operated since the occupation began. They had safe houses hidden across the countryside, paths through the forests, contacts in nearby towns. Their job was to smuggle people out, Jews, Allied pilots, fighters, and now a nun who had just carried out one of the boldest acts of sabotage in the war. Pota told her what happened after her escape. The SS found the bodies within an hour. They locked down the convent and dragged the remaining nuns into interrogations. The sisters knew nothing, and a sergeant with a scar demanded their papers. Pota handed over forged documents. The sergeant studied each of them carefully. When his eyes stopped on Sister Maria, she looked away, terrified he'd recognize her. He asked her something in German she couldn't answer. Christina quickly claimed she was deaf and mute. The sergeant stared at her for a long moment, then unexpectedly returned the papers and told them to leave before his superior arrived. A kilometer later, Pota explained the sergeant had known they were lying but chose to let them go. It happened sometimes this late in the war. Soldiers tired of killing, soldiers who wanted the nightmare to end. He could have arrested them, but instead gave them a chance. Sister Maria wondered if he had known who she was, if he had seen not a fugitive, but an act of defiance even some Germans could respect. She didn't know, but for the first time since the poisoning, she felt a spark of hope. By the 14th night, artillery thundered in the distance as the sky glowed orange from burning villages. The resistance brought her to the edge of a forest shredded by shrapnel. Beyond a distant ridge lay British forces. If she could cross it, she would be safe, but she had to go alone. They couldn't risk entering Allied territory. Pota gave her a white cloth to wave and told her to shout that she was Polish and needed help. He hugged her briefly. Christina and Jakob said their goodbyes and vanished back into the trees, leaving her alone with freedom just ahead. She stared at the ridge for a long time, the cloth limp in her hand. Every part of her body begged for rest, but she forced herself to move. The terrain was brutal, mud churned by tanks, craters filled with stagnant water, twisted metal everywhere. Silence hung heavy, broken only by distant guns and her footsteps. Halfway up, she collapsed. Her body refused to rise, her vision blurred. She realized she was dying. 2 weeks of cold hunger, fear, and guilt had emptied her completely. Lying in the mud, she thought of the poisoned soup, the officers collapsing, the civilians executed in retaliation, the sergeant who let her pass, and the girl shot in the snow. violence and mercy twisted together in her mind. She didn't know if she'd done right, but she knew it was necessary. Then she heard English voices, figures approach, British soldiers. One checked her wounds, another used a radio. She tried to lift the white cloth but couldn't. A soldier spoke. She answered in Polish, "I am a refugee. I need help." He didn't understand until another man who spoke some Polish arrived. She repeated herself, "I am Polish. I escaped the Germans. I need to tell someone what I did." They were confused, full of questions, but they didn't interrogate her. Ja, they lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her down the ridge toward the Allied lines, toward safety, toward a future she never believed she would live to see. Sister Maria spent weeks in a British field hospital healing from starvation, pneumonia, and the cold that had nearly killed her. The nurses couldn't understand how she had survived at all. Most refugees in her state didn't make it past their first night, but Sister Maria held onto life the same way she had held onto courage in that tunnel, in those forests, across those frozen fields. When she was finally strong enough to speak, she told her story to a British intelligence officer assigned to gather information from survivors. But the moment she described what she had done at the convent, he stopped writing. He asked her to repeat it. A nun who had quietly taken out more Nazi officers than some resistance groups. It was unbelievable. To him, it was the perfect story, something that could boost morale and inspire others to fight back. But she refused. She didn't want glory. She didn't want her name in newspapers or her face on posters. She wanted silence. She wanted to return to prayer, to anonymity, to a life far from the blood she had spilled. So the officer filed her account, stamped it secret, and locked it away. After the war, Sister Maria was offered a new life in England, a chance to start over. But she chose to return to Poland, not to the ruins of Posen, but to a quiet convent far away. She took her vows again and lived the next 3 decades as she had before, cooking, gardening, praying, and carrying the weight of what she had done. She never spoke of it again, not once, and when she died in 1977, it seemed her secret had died with her. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. In 1991, a historian digging through declassified British files found a forgotten report about a nun who had poisoned 47 SS officers. He began to investigate, piecing together a story the world had never heard. His findings shocked Poland, but barely reached beyond it. The world had moved on. Wars, conflicts, crises. There was always something louder. But this story mattered because Sister Maria proved something the world forgets. That resistance isn't always grand battles and famous names. Sometimes it's one ordinary person refusing to bow to evil. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained. She was a 52-year-old nun who used the only tool she had, a pot of soup and a vial of poison, and struck back at monsters who would never stop unless someone stopped them. And yes, the cost was horrific. Her actions led to the execution of innocent civilians. She carried that guilt for life, but she also saved countless future victims, families who would have been torn apart, villages burned, lives erased. The reason her story vanished is simple. It didn't fit the clean, heroic version of history. Real resistance is messy, painful, morally complicated. It forces us to confront questions we would rather avoid. When violence becomes necessary, what ordinary people can do when pushed to the edge, and what it truly costs to fight back. But now you know about the nun who became an unexpected force of justice. You know how she escaped, survived, and then chose silence. You know how her story was buried, not because it was untrue, but because it was uncomfortable. So here's the challenge. Remember her, share her, because if stories like hers disappear, we lose proof that ordinary people with nothing but courage can change the course of history. Sister Maria didn't wait for a hero. She became one.